I don't know when exactly Craigslist became such a normal part of life, but at some point, almost everyone I know has used it. Buying cheap furniture, finding a place to stay, picking up quick jobs. It always felt like a simple solution to everyday problems. You message someone, agree on a time, meet, and move on. Nothing about it ever felt dangerous, at least, that's what I thought back then. Looking back now, I can see how easily you start trusting people you've never actually met. A name, a message, maybe a profile picture, and somehow that feels like enough. The thing is, none of the situations I'm about to talk about felt wrong in the beginning. That's probably the hardest part to explain. Each one started in a way that made complete sense at the time. Small decisions, normal conversations, nothing that stood out. And if I'm being honest, there were moments where something felt slightly off, but not enough to stop, not enough to walk away. I didn't realize it then, but those were the moments that mattered most, because by the time things actually felt dangerous, it was already too late. These aren't stories about obvious threats or instant fear. They're about how normal everything seemed right up until it wasn't, and how sometimes the most unsettling part isn't what happened, but how easily it could have been avoided. That thought still stays with me now. Story 1. The buyer who wouldn't leave set up the first time something like this happened to me. It didn't feel unusual at all. If anything, it felt routine. I was getting ready to move out of my apartment, trying to get rid of a few things I didn't want to take with me, and the couch was one of them. It wasn't anything special, just a basic gray couch I'd bought a couple years earlier. Still in decent shape, comfortable enough, but too bulky to move and not worth the effort. Listing it on Craigslist felt like the easiest option. At the time, I was living alone. It was a small one-bedroom place, second floor, quiet building. I'd been there for almost a year, and nothing about it ever felt unsafe. I'd sold a couple things online before, too. A desk, some kitchen stuff, even an old TV once. People would come by, take a look, pay, and leave. Simple, so when I posted the couch, I didn't really think twice about it. The message came in later that same day. Short, polite, straight to the point. He asked if it was still available, said he could pick it up soon, and didn't try to negotiate the price too much. There was something slightly eager about the way he wrote, but not enough to stand out. If anything, it just felt like he really wanted it. We exchanged a few messages back and forth. He seemed normal. No weird questions, no strange requests, just basic details. He said evenings worked best for him, and I agreed without really thinking about it. Looking back, that's probably where I should have paused for a second. By the time we set an exact time, it was already getting late. Not late enough to feel dangerous, but late enough that it would be dark outside. I remember noticing that, just briefly, but I brushed it off almost immediately. I'd done this before. Plenty of people come after work. Normal. The day of the pickup, I cleaned the place a little, mostly out of habit. I moved a few things around so the couch was easier to access. Cleared the path to the door. Everything felt ordinary, predictable. As it got closer to the time, I checked my phone a couple times to make sure he hadn't cancelled. He hadn't. In fact, he sent a message saying he was on his way. That party then didn't bother me either. If anything, it made things feel more certain, like everything was going exactly how it should. Still, I remember standing by the window for a second, just watching the parking lot below. It was darker than I expected. Most of the lights in the building were already on, and the area felt quieter than usual. For a moment, I hesitated. It wasn't a strong feeling, just a quick thought that passed through my head. Something like, maybe I should have asked someone to be here. But then again, that felt unnecessary. I'd done this before. Nothing had ever gone wrong. So I let that thought go, almost as quickly as it came, turned away from the window, and went back inside to wait. When he finally arrived, it felt exactly how these things usually go at first. A knock at the door. Nothing aggressive or rushed, just normal. I opened it, and he was standing there holding his phone, like he'd just double-checked the address. He smiled right away, introduced himself, and apologized for being a few minutes late. His tone was relaxed, almost overly friendly. The kind of person who talks a little too much, but not in a way that feels threatening. At first, it actually made things feel easier. I let him in, showed him the couch, and he immediately started talking. Not just about the couch, but about random things. Where I got it, how long I'd lived there, why I was moving, questions that didn't really have anything to do with the sale. I answered without thinking too much about it. That's how these interactions usually go. Small talk, a little back and forth, then they leave. but he didn't really focus on the couch for very long. Instead, he started looking around, not in a subtle way either. His eyes moved slowly across the room, like he was taking everything in. He walked a few steps past the couch, glanced toward the kitchen, then toward the hallway. At one point, he even leaned slightly to look into the bedroom area without actually stepping inside. I remember noticing it, but I didn't say anything. It felt off, but not enough to call out. So I just stood there, trying to keep the conversation moving back to the couch, asking if he liked it, if he wanted to check the cushions, anything to keep things on track. He nodded, said it looked good, but didn't move toward paying or leaving. Instead, he kept talking. More questions, more comments. Some of them didn't really make sense, like asking how often people came over, or if the building was usually this quiet. I laughed it off, gave short answers, and tried to signal that the interaction was wrapping up, the way people usually do, shifting their posture, stepping slightly toward the door. But he didn't pick up on it. Or maybe he did, and just ignored it. He moved a little closer to the hallway again, then back toward the living room, like he was trying to memorize the layout. That's when I started to feel it more clearly. Not fear, exactly, just a kind of tension, a quiet awareness that something about this wasn't going the way it normally does. Still, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was just awkward. Maybe it didn't realize he was lingering. He'd be leaving any second. Looking back now, that's the part that stands out the most. Those small moments where something felt slightly off, but not serious enough to act on. At the time, it didn't seem like a big deal. Now, it feels like the beginning of everything. At some point, the conversation started looping. I'd ask if he wanted to take the couch, and he'd say yes, but then immediately follow it with something else. Another question, another comment, something just enough to delay actually finishing the interaction. It wasn't obvious at first, but after a few minutes, it became harder to ignore. He never once reached for his wallet. Instead, he kept shifting his attention around the apartment. He stepped closer to the kitchen this time, actually leaning in and glancing at the counter like he was inspecting it. Then he walked back, slower, looking at the walls, the shelves, even the door. I remember standing there, trying to keep my voice steady, asking again if he needed help moving the couch, or if he had someone outside with him. He said he came alone. That answer sat with me longer than it should have, because now I was thinking about how he expected to move it, and more importantly, how long he was planning to stay. I told him we should probably carry it out together, just to move things along. He nodded, but didn't move. Instead, he stepped a little closer to me, like he was about to say something, then paused. That pause felt different. The tone of the whole interaction shifted right there. It wasn't friendly anymore. It wasn't casual. There was something heavier in it, something harder to explain. He asked me if I always lived alone, not in a curious way, more like he was confirming something. I gave a short answer, tried to keep it vague, but I could feel my body starting to tense up, without me meaning to. That's when I became aware of how quiet everything was. No voices in the hallway, no footsteps, just the two of us, inside the apartment. He turned slightly, positioning himself between me and the door without making it obvious. If you looked at it from the outside, it wouldn't seem intentional, but standing there, it felt very clear. I remember thinking, this isn't normal anymore. I tried to shift things back again, told him I had somewhere to be soon, that we should probably wrap this up. I even reached for my phone, more as a reflex than anything else. He didn't respond right away. He just looked at me for a second, then smiled again, but it didn't feel the same as before. It was slower, controlled. And then he said something I can't really forget. He said, "You seem nervous." Not loud, not aggressive, just direct. That was the moment it clicked. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a delayed sale anymore. I felt that quiet kind of panic, the kind that doesn't show on the outside, but tightens everything inside you. My thoughts started moving faster, trying to figure out how to end this without making it worse. So I did the first thing that came to mind. I pretended to call someone. I lifted my phone, stepped slightly away, and said something like, "Yeah, he's here now. We're about to bring it down." I made sure to say it clearly, loud enough for him to hear. There was a shift almost immediately. He stepped back, just a little, but enough to break that position near the door. His posture changed, like something about the situation had just become less certain for him. I kept talking into the phone, even though no one was on the line. Mentioned a name, said they'd be upstairs in a minute. For a few seconds, he just stood there. Then he nodded quickly this time, and said he'd come back later instead. No argument. No hesitation. He moved toward the door, opened it himself, and left. Just like that, I didn't follow him out. I didn't say anything else. I just waited until I heard his footsteps disappear down the stairs. Then I locked the door immediately. And even after that, I stood there for a while, just listening, because for the first time since he arrived, the apartment felt quiet again, but it didn't feel safe anymore. After he left, I didn't move for a while. I just stood there near the door, listening to the silence, trying to make sure he was into coming back. Every small sound outside made me tense up again, like I was expecting another knock. Eventually, I walked through the apartment and checked everything. The windows, the hallway, even the bathroom. It didn't really make sense, but I needed to feel like I was in control of the space again. The couch was still there, untouched, and that's when it really started to sink in. Nothing had actually happened. He didn't threaten me, didn't force anything, didn't do something I could clearly point to and explain. But the feeling I had standing there, realizing how quickly things could have shifted, stayed with me. I kept replaying it in my head. The questions he asked, the way he looked around, the moment he stood near the door. All those small things I brushed off at the time. Looking back, they felt obvious, but in the moment, they didn't seem like enough. That was the part that bothered me the most. After that, I stopped letting people come inside. If I had to sell something, I'd meet them outside, in public, or not at all. It just wasn't worth the risk anymore. Even being alone in the apartment felt different for a while. Quieter, but not in a comfortable way. More like I was aware of it now. And the thought that kept coming back was simple. Nothing actually happened, but it very easily could have. Story 2. The roommate AD that went wrong, set up the second story, didn't happen to me in the same apartment, but it happened not long after, when things in my life were a little more unstable than I liked to admit. I had just switched jobs, and the pay wasn't as steady as I expected. Rent started to feel heavier every month, and after a while, it stopped being something I could comfortably manage on my own. At first, I tried to cut expenses, convince myself it was temporary, but eventually, it became clear I needed help covering the rent. That's when I turned to Craigslist again. I remember hesitating before posting the ad, not because I thought something bad would happen, but because it felt like giving up a bit of control over my space. Still, it seemed like the fastest option. No long applications, no waiting lists, just a post, a few messages, and someone moves in. Within a day, I got a few responses. Most of them were easy to ignore, too vague, too pushy, or just didn't feel right. But one message stood out because it was simple, polite, clear, and not overly eager. They introduced themselves, mentioned their job, and asked a few normal questions about the place. Nothing unnecessary, nothing that made me pause. It felt balanced. We agreed to meet the next evening. When they arrived, everything about the interaction felt smooth. They were quiet, but not in an uncomfortable way. Jos? Reserved. They spoke clearly, didn't overshare, didn't ask anything strange. We walked through the apartment together. I showed them the room, the kitchen, the bathroom. They nodded, took a quick look around, and said it worked for them. There was no long discussion, no negotiation. They agreed to the rent, said they could move in by the end of the week, and that was it. Looking back, I think what made it feel so easy was how normal everything seemed. No complications, no hesitation. It felt like I got lucky. The first few days after they moved in were quiet. We didn't interact much, but that didn't feel unusual. Everyone has their own routine, their own space. They kept their door closed most of the time, but when we crossed paths, they were polite. A quick hello in the kitchen. Short conversations about nothing important, just enough interaction to make things feel comfortable, but not enough to feel intrusive. Our schedules didn't overlap much either. I'd leave early some days, come back late others. Sometimes I wouldn't even hear them come in or out. It was like we were sharing the same space, without really crossing into each other's lives. At the time, I actually appreciated that. There was no tension, no awkwardness, just a quiet understanding that we were both there for the same reason. Pay the rent, live our lives, and keep things simple. If anything, it felt easier than I expected. Almost too easy. But I didn't think about that part back then. To me, it just felt like things had worked out. Like I had found exactly what I needed. Exactly when I needed it. And for a while, that's all it seemed to be. For the first couple of weeks, nothing stood out. If anything, the quiet made everything easier. We stayed out of each other's way, kept things clean, paid bills on time. It felt like the kind of roommate situation people hope for. But after a while, small things started to feel slightly off. Not obvious, not enough to question right away. Just subtle shifts that didn't really have a clear explanation. It started with their schedule. At first, I didn't pay attention to it. Everyone has different routines, but I began noticing that I'd wake up in the middle of the night sometimes, and I'd hear movement from their room. Not loud, not disruptive, just quiet footsteps, or the sound of something being moved. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. Maybe they worked late, or had trouble sleeping. I told myself that and went back to sleep. But it kept happening. Not every night, but often enough that I started expecting it. Waking up at random hours and just lying there, listening. Trying to figure out what they were doing without actually getting up. Sometimes it sounded like pacing. Other times, like drawers opening and closing. And once or twice, I thought I heard the door open. But when I checked in the morning, everything looked normal. Their door would be closed, just like always. That was another thing. It was always closed. At first, I didn't think much of it. Privacy is normal, but over time it started to feel intentional, like a boundary that wasn't meant to be crossed. We spoke less, not because anything happened, just naturally, or at least, that's how it felt. The short conversations in the kitchen became even shorter. Sometimes just a nod, sometimes nothing at all. And when I tried to start a conversation, it felt like I was interrupting something. They'd respond, but their answers felt delayed, like they were thinking about something else while talking to me. I told myself they were just quiet. That's how they were from the beginning. But then I started noticing things in the apartment. Small things. At first, it was something like a cup being in a different place than I remembered leaving it, or a chair slightly moved. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to make me pause for a second. I'd stand there, trying to remember if I had moved it myself. Most of the time, I convinced myself I had. It's easy to doubt your own memory over something that small. But it kept happening. Not constantly, but often enough to build this low, constant uncertainty. And when I asked about it, casually, like it wasn't a big deal, they always gave the same kind of response. Short, flat. They hadn't touched anything. Noisy, no confusion. Just a simple denial. After a while, I stopped asking. It felt pointless. Instead, I started paying closer attention, trying to notice patterns, trying to catch something that would make it all make sense. That's when things started to feel heavier. I began noticing the way they looked at me sometimes. Not directly, more like I'd turn my head suddenly and catch them already looking, just for a second. Then they'd look away, like nothing happened. It wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't normal either. There was something off about the timing, like they were watching longer than they should have been. Eye contact became strange. Either they avoided it completely, or held it just a little too long. There wasn't a comfortable middle anymore. Even their tones started to change. Still quiet, still controlled, but sometimes they'd say things that didn't quite fit the conversation, like answering a question I didn't ask, or bringing up something I hadn't mentioned. The first time it happened, I thought I misheard them. The second time, I thought maybe I wasn't paying attention. By the third or fourth time, I stopped trying to explain it. I just accepted that something felt wrong, even if I couldn't prove it. And that was the hardest part. There was no clear moment where I could say, this is the problem. No single event that justified how I was starting to feel. Just a slow build. A collection of small, disconnected things that didn't quite add up. Looking back, I think that's what made it worse. Because the entire time, I was stuck between two thoughts. Maybe I'm overthinking this. Or maybe I'm not taking it seriously enough. And the more I tried to figure out which one it was, the harder it became to ignore the feeling that something inside the apartment had changed. Not in a visible way, but in a way I couldn't explain. And once I started noticing it, I couldn't stop. The night it happened, nothing felt different at first. I went to bed the same way I always did. Locked the door, turned off the lights, checked my phone for a bit, then tried to fall asleep. The apartment was quiet. No movement, no sounds from the other room. For once, it actually felt still. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. There wasn't a loud noise or anything obvious that pulled me out of sleep. It was more like my body just decided to wake up on its own. That kind of sudden awareness, where your eyes open before your mind catches up. At first, I didn't move. I just lay there, staring into the dark, trying to figure out what had woken me. And then I noticed it. There was something off about the room. It took a second to register, but the air felt different. Like the kind of silence that isn't empty, but occupied. That's when I turned my head. They were standing there, right next to my bed, close enough that I could see the outline of their face in the dark. Not moving, not saying anything, just standing there, looking at me. For a second, I couldn't react. My brain didn't process it as real right away. It felt like I was still dreaming, like my eyes were playing a trick on me. But then they shifted slightly, just enough to confirm it, and everything in me went completely still. I didn't sit up. I didn't speak. I just stared back, trying to understand what I was looking at. They weren't holding anything. They weren't doing anything. Just standing, watching. The silence stretched longer than it should have. And then, without changing their expression, they spoke. Their voice was quiet. Flat, they said. You were awake earlier. It wasn't a question. It wasn't said with curiosity or concern. It was just stated. Like they were pointing out a fact. I didn't answer right away. I didn't know how to... My mind was trying to catch up, trying to find a reason that made sense. Why they were in my room. Why they were standing there. How long they had been there before I woke up. None of it added up. I finally said something. I don't even remember what exactly. Something simple, like asking what they were doing. They didn't respond. They just kept looking at me. And then, after a few seconds, they turned, slowly, walked out of the room, and closed the door behind them. No explanation. No apology. Nothing. I stayed there for a long time after that. Not moving. Not sleeping. Just staring at the door, waiting to hear something else. Another sound. Another step. But there was nothing. Just silence again. And that was the moment it became clear. Whatever I had been trying to explain away before, whatever small things I had been ignoring, none of it mattered anymore. Because this wasn't something I could rationalize. This wasn't normal. And I knew, without needing to think about it any longer, that I couldn't stay there anymore. I didn't leave that night. I thought about it. Moretanonse. Sitting there in the dark, staring at the door. Every part of me wanted to get up, grab whatever I could, and just walk out. But it was the middle of the night, and I didn't even know where I'd go. So I waited. I stayed in bed until the sun started coming up, barely moving, barely breathing, just listening. Every small sound made my body tense again, but nothing else happened. When it finally got light outside, I got up. I didn't knock on their door. I didn't try to talk to them or ask for an explanation. I just started packing. It wasn't organized or planned. I threw things into bags, grabbed what I needed, left whatever didn't matter. The whole time, I kept expecting the door to open, for them to walk out and say something, but they didn't. I never saw them again. I left the keys on the counter, sent a short message later saying I was moving out, and that was it. No response. No follow-up. Just silence. For a while after, I kept going over it in my head, trying to make sense of it. Maybe they were sleepwalking? Maybe they had some kind of condition. Something they didn't tell me about. I tried to find explanations that felt reasonable. Something I could hold on to so it didn't feel as unsettling. But none of it really fit, because even if there was a reason, it didn't change how it felt in that moment. Standing there, in the dark, watching me. And I think that's what stayed with me the most. Not knowing why. Not knowing what they were thinking. And realizing that sometimes you can share a space with someone and still have no idea who they really are. Story 3. The job offer setup the third time started the same way the others did. With something simple. I was between paychecks. Not completely broke, but close enough that I had to start thinking about it. Groceries, gas, small things that add up faster than you expect. It wasn't urgent yet, but it was getting there. So I went back to Craigslist. Not for anything big. Just something quick. A short job. A few hours. Enough to cover the gap until things settled again. That's when I saw the post. It was straightforward. Someone needed help moving a few items out of a storage space. Nothing heavy, just boxers, maybe some furniture. Said it would take 2 or 3 hours. Cash paid at the end. The amount was decent. Not too high to feel unrealistic, but enough to make it worth the time. I remember reading it more than once, checking for anything that felt off, but it all looked normal. The wording was clear, the details made sense. So I responded. The reply came back faster than I expected. Short messages, direct, polite. They confirmed the time, gave me an address, and told me what to expect. There was no unnecessary conversation, no extra questions, just enough to set everything up. If anything, it felt more organized than most posts like that. We agreed to meet the next afternoon. The location was on the edge of the city, not too far, but not somewhere I went often. A small storage facility, according to the message. I looked it up briefly, saw that it existed, and didn't think much beyond that. The day of the job. Everything felt normal. I got ready, grabbed what I needed, and drove out there. Traffic was light. The weather was clear. Nothing out of place. The kind of day where everything feels predictable. As I got closer, the area started to quiet down. Fewer buildings, fewer cars, longer stretches of road without much around. Not completely isolated, but enough that it felt different from where I usually was. Still, it didn't feel wrong, just unfamiliar. When I pulled into the lot, there were only a couple of other vehicles there. The storage units were lined up in rows, most of them closed. It was quiet, but not empty. I checked my phone, made sure I was at the right place. A message came through almost immediately. They said they were already there. I got out of the car and looked around. A few seconds later, someone stepped out from between the units. They waved slightly, like they had been waiting. From a distance, everything about them seemed normal. Casual clothes, relaxed posture. Nothing that stood out. When they got closer, they greeted me the same way anyone would. Friendly, not overly talkative, just enough to keep things moving. They pointed toward one of the units, already unlocked, and explained what needed to be done. Boxers stacked inside, a few items near the back. Nothing unusual. The instructions were clear. Simple. Exactly what the post had described. And standing there, looking at everything, it felt like just another small job. The kind you finish quickly and forget about later. At least, that's what it felt like at the time. At first, the work was exactly what I expected. I stepped into the storage unit, grabbed the first box, and carried it out to where they pointed. They stayed nearby, watching, occasionally giving small directions. Nothing unusual about that. Some people just like to supervise. For the first few minutes, it felt straightforward. In and out, box after box. But then I started noticing how quiet everything was. Not just around the unit, but the entire area. No doors opening, no cars pulling in, no voices in the distance, just the sound of my footsteps and the occasional scrape of something being moved. I remember pausing for a second, looking down the row of units. Empty, it felt more isolated than it had when I arrived. I told myself it was just the time of day, middle of the afternoon, people at work. Nothing strange about that, so I kept going. After a while, the instructions started to change. At first, they had me stacking everything near the entrance. Simple, eno, who, but then they asked me to start placing certain boxers off to the side, separate from the others. I asked why, just casually. They said they needed to organize things differently. The answer was quick, but it didn't really explain much. Still, I didn't push it. It wasn't my stuff. I was just there to help. But then the requests got more specific. Don't open that one. Leave those where they are. Take this one to the back instead. Each instruction came with less explanation than the last, and the way they said it started to feel different, less friendly, more controlled. Like they weren't just asking anymore. I noticed it in their tone first, then in the way they stood, a little closer than before, always within view. Watching, not helping. Who's watching? I told myself that was normal, too. Some people don't want others handling their things too much, but something about it didn't sit right. At one point, I stepped outside the unit for a second, just to get some air, and instinctively reached for my phone. No signal. That caught my attention more than anything else so far. I checked again, moved around a little, held it, Eiger, nothing. It wasn't something I had noticed when I first arrived, and suddenly, the quiet felt heavier. I looked around again. Still, no one. Just rows of closed doors, stretching in both directions. That's when the thought came in. This is a little weird. Not dangerous. Not enough to stop. Just weird. I went back inside. They were standing in the same place, exactly where I left them. Watching me. I told myself it didn't matter. It was a short job. I'd be done soon. But then they asked me to move something from the very back of the unit. Something heavier this time. I stepped further inside, deeper than I had been before, and as I did, I noticed how narrow the space felt, how far the entrance suddenly seemed. I turned slightly. Who's to check? They were standing near the opening, not blocking it completely, but close enough. Close enough that I noticed. That same quiet tension from before started to build again. That feeling where nothing has actually happened, but something feels off in a way you can't explain. I remember thinking two things at the same time. This isn't right, and just finish the job. Because walking away felt awkward, unnecessary, like I'd be overreacting. I needed the money. It was almost done. So I kept going, even though, at that point, I couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. Something about the situation had changed, and I was already in the middle of it. I don't remember the exact moment it shifted, just that it did. I was near the back of the unit, lifting one of the heavier boxers, when I heard the sound of the metal door move. Not slam. Not close, all the way. Just shift. That small, hollow sound echoed more than it should have. I froze for a second, then turned. From where I was standing, I couldn't see the full entrance anymore. Just the edge of it, slightly darker than before. And then I heard it. The latch, a quiet click. Not loud, not aggressive, just enough to be unmistakable. Something in my chest tightened immediately. I set the box down slowly, trying not to make noise, and stepped forward. Each step felt heavier than it should have, like I was suddenly aware of every movement. As I got closer, I could see the outline of the door. Closed, not fully sealed, but pulled in enough that the light from outside had narrowed to a thin strip. And they were standing there, right in front of it, facing away from me, one hand near the latch. For a second, I didn't say anything. I just stood there, trying to understand what I was looking at. Then Primer asked it, as calmly as I could, if everything was okay. They didn't turn around right away, just stood still. And then, after a few seconds, they said, just making sure nothing falls. It didn't make sense. Nothing near the entrance had moved. Nothing needed to be secured. But the way they said it, it wasn't defensive. It wasn't even convincing. It was just empty. Like the words didn't matter. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about the job anymore. I looked at the door again. Then, at them, and I realized how little control I had in that moment. No signal on my phone, no one else around, and the only way out was a few feet in front of them. I felt that same quiet panic from before, but stronger this time. Sharper, more immediate. I didn't react right away. Instead, I stepped back slightly, like I was going to grab something else. Then I said I needed to get something from my car. I kept my voice steady, casual, like it wasn't urgent. For a second, they didn't respond. Then they shifted. Just enough, their hand moved away from the latch. And that was all I needed. I walked forward. Not too fast, not slow enough to seem hesitant, just steady. When I reached the door, I pulled it open and stepped outside without looking back. I didn't stop walking until I reached my car. And even then, I didn't turn around. I just unlocked the doors and drove away, leaving everything else behind. I didn't stop driving for a while. At first, I just focused on the road, hands tight on the wheel, trying to keep everything steady. My mind felt like it was catching up in pieces, like it hadn't fully processed what had just happened yet. It wasn't until I was back in a busier area, around other cars, that I started to feel it, that delayed wave of realization. I pulled over for a minute, just to breathe, and that's when the questions started coming in. What was that? Why did they close the door? What would have happened if I hadn't said anything? There wasn't a clear answer to any of it. No explanation, no follow-up message. Nothing that gave it a clean ending. I didn't go back. Didn't try to contact them again. I just left it exactly where it ended. And that uncertainty stayed with me. Because the more I thought about it, the more I realized how easily I had walked into that situation. I simply post a quick message. An address that seemed normal enough. And that was all it took. No warning. No obvious sign to stop. Just a series of small decisions that felt reasonable at the time. Until they didn't. When I think back on all three of those experiences, the part that stays with me isn't just what happened. It's how normal everything felt before it did. There wasn't a single moment at the beginning where something clearly warned me to stop. No obvious danger. No immediate fear. Just small decisions that made sense at the time. Selling something I didn't need. Trying to save money. Taking a simple job for quick cash. Each situation started in a way that anyone could relate to. That's what makes it harder to recognize. Because when something feels familiar, you don't question it the same way. You trust it more. You assume it will follow the same pattern as every other normal interaction you had before. And most of the time, it does. But not always. Looking back, the signs were there. Small things. Easy to ignore. Easy to explain away in the moment. And that's the part that changes how you see things afterward. Not the fear itself, but the realization that it didn't feel like fear until it was already too late. Now, I think about those moments differently. The quiet pauses. The things that don't quite add up. The feeling that something is slightly off, even if you can't explain why. Because danger doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always look the way you expect it to. Sometimes, it feels completely ordinary. And by the time it doesn't, you're already in it.